I want to introduce you to yourself, who you are right now, your ordinary consciousness. So let's see if you can understand this. Your mind, I would suggest, is very much like a sponge. This is a sea sponge that I picked up from the beach. And all of your perceptions, everything that you know, your mind knows, happens within this sponge. All colors, all emotions, all objects, time and even space itself is created by your spongy mind. So when you look over there and you see a big pine tree, this sponge that is your mind actually stretches, creates all this space between me and the tree, and then it creates the tree. It doesn't just create a shape, it creates in this mental space a three-dimensional object with colors. It has height, of course. It has a density as well. Like, I wouldn't want to run into the tree because my mind has created an object that says to me, that's hard, and I'll hit that and get hurt. So there's connotations associated with the tree, and it also generates a texture for that tree. Like, I can almost imagine touching it, and it creates all sorts of connotations on the tree. So I would suggest this is what your mind is. It's a sponge that creates all of perceptions. Of course, this reality, our ordinary consciousness, it is not, most people would agree, enlightenment by itself, because it doesn't explain where you came from or who you are at the deepest level or what the universe is, what existence is. There's all these mysteries that the mind just cannot grasp. And I'm going to suggest that your mind, my mind, perhaps even a dog's mind, there's two reasons that the mind will never grasp what enlightenment is. It cannot grasp it. It's not capable. The first reason is very simple, that your spongy mind is small. It's like an ant. If an ant is trying to grasp what an elephant is, it just cannot do it. The ant is too small to imagine what an elephant is. Its little tiny little nervous system can't grow that big. You know, your spongy mind, it can imagine a lot of fantastic things, but it can't expand into infinity. So enlightenment exists, but it exists outside of the mind. But there's also, I would suggest, a bit of a technical reason why the mind really struggles to even conceptualize an idea of what enlightenment is. And that is because the mind really likes to work with dualities. That's like the operating system almost of how we work, how we live. And what I mean by that, dualities, is almost everything we know has an opposite. So something is either tasty or yucky, or it looks beautiful or it looks ugly. We have up and we have down. You know, everything has an opposite. But enlightenment is not like that at all. Of course, there's some exceptions, like for instance, colors. Do they really have an opposite? But when conceptualizing things, the mind either wants to attribute qualities to something like a color or a shape, or point out some duality like good and bad. But enlightenment is not like that at all. So a deeper spiritual analogy that I like, putting the sponge aside now, is that your mind is like a flame, a tongue of a flame, if you can imagine that. It's a bit of a strange choice of words, but it's like one tongue of a flame on a pile of logs. So you've got all these logs, they're all burning, and your individual consciousness is like one tongue, one flame. So perhaps you can imagine that in your mind. And ultimately, these flames, they come from the same source. They can all connect if you go back inwards and find out where it is that the flame comes from. But just by itself, the flame is not it. So, how can you experience what is outside of the mind? It seems almost impossible. So, I would give you a magical solution, or the key solution. A lot of people's minds, to varying degrees, is somewhat cementified, or it's like locked in place. Even this sponge is a little bit like that. It's kind of a little bit hard and coarse. If this was in, a pristine environment, even in our imagination, this sponge would be all sorts of colors. It would be very colorful. It would be very bouncy, dynamic. It could stretch a lot. It could stretch over here, stretch over there. Imagine this, imagine that. But if just through the human condition, we're living our lives, we start to stop imagining, and the mind becomes sort of smaller and smaller, but it also becomes very rigid. If you imagine a stereotypical person that just goes to work every day, comes back home, watches the news, just watches sitcoms, it's very limited. But this mind of ours can actually open up like a coral or a sponge. It opens up the pores. It opens up the spongy space between the sponge, the empty space inside the sponge, that opens up. And how does it open up? Well, the mind needs some help. It needs love. Love is the magical solution. And love is very tricky to access. It's not exactly something you just imagine or do. There is, of course, a little bit of a cheat code built into the universe, and that is psychedelics. Something like DMT or 5-MeO-DMT bring so much love to the equation that it almost blows apart this mind. It opens it up forcefully, and then it experiences enlightenment. What's out here? It doesn't experience just the contents that's stuck here, but it experiences what's beyond the mind. But when you take a psychedelic, like I said, it's quite forceful. When enlightenment happens naturally, just because there's a natural outpouring of love, there's a different quality to enlightenment because it feels natural, beautiful, harmonious, rather than being shaken or torn apart. So, our job, even if we're taking psychedelics or meditating, it's sort of to remove the obstacles to enlightenment rather than to imagine enlightenment, because we can never imagine enlightenment. But on this sponge that is our mind, we have all sorts of sticky, yucky things, like maybe we have a dead cockroach even, like stuck on our mind, and this dead cockroach could be like animosity or jealousy or hatred or sloth or lust. We have all sorts of little rocks and tarry, yucky bits of oil that's spilt on our minds. We have all this stuff attached to the mind, and we're trying to remove that through a process of kriya, through a process of meditation. This is why it takes so much time, if you're meditating, to achieve something like enlightenment, because there's a lot of obstacles. By taking a psychedelic, I think a lot of insight can be had towards these obstacles, because it's actually fascinating to me. I experienced something like this again just the other day. You can go your whole life as a mind with a giant ugly cockroach stuck to you, but the mind, it's looking that way. It doesn't see the ugly cockroach. And psychedelics, they open the mind somewhat forcefully, but it reveals to you in that process of opening all sorts of karma and obstacles and samsaras, if you want to use a Hindu word, that was preventing us from the truth. Because if we're just meditating, it can be hard to see these obstacles, let alone to break through them, and let alone to love them. Remember earlier I said the magic solution to experiencing enlightenment is love? Well, that's also true for removing these obstacles. Even if you detect within you a cockroach that's stuck to your mind, like jealousy, just for example, it's hard to get rid of it because you might judge this cockroach that's stuck to your mind, but judging it, as many people know, judging your negative qualities doesn't get rid of them. And actually what removes the cockroach is loving it. And that's a hard thing to do, but I do think psychedelics can be helpful in that. So let's talk a little bit more about enlightenment. What can I say about this vast space that's outside the mind? First of all, there's not just inside the mind and then outside. There are sort of like layers to it. So the first time you have an enlightenment experience, it'll be very profound, but invariably it's not the deepest level of enlightenment. However, even if it's not an ultimate, biggest, profoundest enlightenment that's possible, I think it's very fair and adequate to use the word enlightenment. The number one reason why is, on a mystical level, when you go outside your mind, there's so much light. If you've taken 5-MeO-DMT, a nice dose, at least for me, there is so much actual light. Usually white light, sometimes golden light. And this light, it feels very much in unison with love. And it's outside the mind. But also this light, this divine energy, actually imbues the mind, it enters the mind, it descends into the human mind, and it rewires the sponge to be more in contact, more open to divinity, if that makes any sense. But talking more about the qualities of this enlightenment. So there's sort of a consensus from yogis and monks and meditators, and this consensus goes throughout various religions and through thousands of years. There's a consensus that the last thing you can say about enlightenment, at what's outside your mind, the last thing you can say is a trinity, that reality is a trinity. In Hinduism, this would be called Sat Chit Ananda, which I won't talk about too much, but that means existence, consciousness, and bliss. So right now, I can definitely contact existence. I can definitely contact consciousness. I'm aware that I'm conscious. I'm aware that things exist. But this aspect of bliss seems to be sorely missing. Most of life is quite a lot of suffering. Only very rarely do we feel really, truly, deeply, genuinely happy. And once you start to interact with enlightenment, you notice that even when you were happy in the past, that's nothing in comparison to the bliss of enlightenment. The bliss is just total and overwhelming. So what does enlightenment feel like? And what is perhaps one more word we can give to enlightenment? What it is that exists outside of your normal human consciousness. I personally like two words. There's two words when I think of what is outside of my mind. One is the kingdom of God, which is sort of a Christian reference, but I like that. The kingdom of God is quite apt. But there's another word I learned recently. I don't think there's a good English equivalent word. Maybe there is. If you know, let me know. But in Sanskrit, it's called Anurdesham, which I hope I'm pronouncing correct. But what that word means, anurdesham, is, by definition, this word means that which cannot be explained or vocalized or understood by the mind. So we're coming again to this idea of an ant trying to comprehend an elephant. And I think this is a useful word, anurdesham. I use it in my own meditation. Anurdesham is that which cannot be comprehended by the mind. Because there's this tendency when we have a goal of enlightenment to imagine enlightenment or to fantasize about enlightenment. But if we just remind ourselves what enlightenment is, what's the most accurate word, it's anurdesham, that which cannot be understood. So let's explain now, what does enlightenment feel like to the human mind? So this is you're the human mind, and you're trying to access that which is external to it. Perhaps you take a psychedelic, lots of love comes up, and your mind opens up. What that feels like is, to me at least, of course you could give thousands of metaphors, but it very, very literally feels like you're being touched by God. And this touching of God is there's so much love associated to that. It's unbelievable, the bliss and of course the consciousness is massive. It's super mind. It's much more conscious and intelligent than us. But what strikes me is the amount of love and bliss and fulfillment and happiness. Everything, anything that this mind could ever have dreamt of gets satisfied to the 1000th degree by being touched by God. And at that point, one starts to realize over time that the mind is not separate from the external. You know, maybe I'll take a nice close-up of this sponge. There's actually little like hairs attached to it. I'm not sure what those hairs are. Some sort of filaments from the ocean. But through an abstract way that's very hard to describe using words, you are not separate from the ultimate grand reality. Nothing is separate from God. And I've already given you the secret how to feel that for yourself, and that is through love. It's very interesting when people have these experiences. It's very often, of course, feels like it happens at the heart rather than the head. But it can happen at the head, it can happen anywhere, it can happen everywhere. That's actually the most complete enlightenment experience, perhaps one which happens everywhere rather than a location in the body. So that's getting close to everything I wanted to say on this topic, I believe, about enlightenment. I guess there's two more things I should quickly mention. A lot of people in the world claim to be enlightened. So I would suggest that I have had many enlightenment experiences because something vastly profound happened that was external to my conceptual mind. It felt like being touched by God, and there was so much light in that experience. And if you take a psychedelic with good intentions and you practice your meditation, you can very much experience enlightenment, I'm sure. Light coming into you. Being an enlightened person is a different claim in my mind. It's not someone who tasted enlightenment once and now is just normal again. You know, that's usually how psychedelics work, is you return from this enlightenment experience almost the same. Usually there's some amount of healing, you have an afterglow for some days or weeks, but the spiritual process continues. It's not like a one-hit wonder where you experience enlightenment and then your life is forever changed and you're in contact with love and bliss and God forever. An enlightened person is someone that has removed all the yucky stuff stuck to the mind, and the God, the white light, has transformed the mind to such a degree that it is in contact with the kingdom of God at all times. And there is nothing more that's deceiving the mind into being like this small, cemented, calcified, limited consciousness. It can totally be in contact with God. It's like that flame on a log that has seen and fully knows that it is the whole fire. The whole of reality is on fire, and it is that fire. An enlightened person is very, very rare, someone that's fully enlightened. But people are in contact with God to varying degrees. I don't think it's a good idea to go around claiming to be enlightened. I don't plan on ever doing something like that. It just seems too vast and infinite, this whole process. And I don't know if there's an end to it. You know, this mushy brain of ours, it's capable of a lot more than we suppose. So we could say that an ant could experience enlightenment. It can come into contact with the kingdom of God, and it can experience the most deepest fulfillment and love that an ant could ever experience. But that's not the ultimate, perhaps. A human being experiences a deeper, more dynamic and profound enlightenment. And by engaging with God, the experience of enlightenment just becomes ever more increasingly rich and dynamic. So it's almost like there isn't an end to enlightenment. But if someone is truly and deeply connected with the kingdom of God, then we could call them a Buddha or a saint. But this is an extremely rare thing, and I think it's something that we should all pursue for us. We should all pursue that for ourselves if it's something that interests you. But the moral of the story is that there's very many layers to this process of enlightenment, and we don't need to worry about becoming an ultimate Buddha that's over here. Just one step outside of the mind is so profound and magnificent. There's no words for it. The magnitude is bigger than anything the mind could ever comprehend, and even then it just becomes more and more and more and more magnificent. So really, that's very much good news. We don't need to try and become an enlightened Buddha or the most enlightened saint ever. All we're doing is going through the process and enjoying the rewards of it. And now I'm coming to the last thing I wanted to say, which is a word I like, which is nirvana. People, I'm sure someone will disagree with me, because these are just words, like I said at the start: enlightenment, being a Buddha or a saint, and nirvana. To me, nirvana is also similar to the word moksha in Hinduism, and that word moksha very clearly means liberation. You're no longer trapped or deceived. You can see through the illusions of the mind, and you don't have any cockroaches stuck to your mind, so you're free, you're liberated. And Indian yogis believe that if you're truly liberated, this gives you an idea of it gives you an idea of the extent of this level of spirituality. Someone who is touching moksha can sit and meditate and exit their body. They can actually dissolve their body into ash and just leave, because their consciousness is so separate from this human existence. So this level of moksha or spirituality is not something that most people experience on even a 5-MeO DMT trip. It's much deeper and full. It is not only an experience, but that experience has imbued the meditator to the depths of his body. But this word moksha is nice as well. It means freedom, liberation. And I think that's what a lot of people want. We want freedom and we want liberation. But again, coming back to Satchitananda, the deepest thing we can say about God, consciousness, existence, and bliss. What we're really missing in life, I believe, is bliss. Nirvana. That's why I like this word nirvana. That's the reward of enlightenment. Nirvana, it's what we've always wanted. It's meeting the true deepest love of our life. It's receiving love and affection from our parents, our godly parents. It is having full power, but so much love and humility that one would never abuse that power. It is having full clarity of who you are, full clarity of where you came from, and at the same time being able to live your life as a human being, or any being, any embodied being, never losing sight of who you really are. It's not only that you're a sponge being touched by God, you are God touching a sponge. And this realization gives the ultimate bliss, the ultimate nirvana. And that's the reward that I sort of use, at least for myself, to encourage myself down this process. And I like to stay not humble exactly, but just realize that I haven't experienced the deepest nirvana that's possible. But these states of nirvana, they're just incomprehensibly nice. They are, sometimes the best way to think about it is in contrast to suffering. Sometimes when you have a healing experience, like you're removing a cockroach, it's unimaginable that you were carrying that cockroach around your whole life and you didn't even know it. If I think back to, let's just say, when I was in my teenage years, the most fun I ever had as a teenager, actually, in comparison to a nirvana, blissful experience, it was hugely painful. Just playing in the pool with friends is fine, but there's so much underlying yuckiness associated in the mind. So much yucky karma. Whereas nirvana is being so free of that and being touched by God. It's, I'm sort of being speechless here, but that's not really a problem. That's the point. Is this nirvana the reward? The water in the, there might be this concept of a holy grail. The water inside the grail, that love, that bliss, is what nirvana is. It's the ultimate reward that any being could ever have. And you can have it to the deepest depth that you could ever imagine. The highest height that you could ever imagine, times 1,000,000. So, I hope that makes some sort of sense to you. My takeaway message for you is that if you're at all interested in these topics, it's entirely, very, very easily accessible to you. So when I say very, very easily, that's relative compared to the reward. The reward of nirvana is so massive, and all you need to do to experience something at least close to that is meditate a few hundred hours, practice your skills, your threefold meditation skill of focusing, having clarity, and having equanimity with the current meditating experience. Practice meditation and yoga for a few hundred hours. Very respectfully engage with certain psychedelics in a respectful, responsible way. And then there's no doubt you will experience enlightenment. And at that point, I just hope that, at that point, when you are touching the kingdom of heaven, and when the kingdom of heaven and God is touching you, at that point you can forget about this video. This video will be superfluous and the ramblings of an inadequate man. At that point, you can just remember the one key magic solution to continue this process, which is love.